Elijah Carter had always known that his path in life wouldn't be easy. Growing up in a neighborhood where the odds were stacked against him, he quickly learned that things weren't always fair. But Elijah had something that most didn't: a deep belief in justice and doing what was right, no matter the cost. This mindset led him to become a police officer. He wanted to be part of something bigger, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, and to make a real difference. But what he didn't expect was how much of a challenge it would be to stay true to his values. From the very beginning, Elijah noticed things that didn't sit right with him. Officers who ignored complaints, colleagues who used their power for the wrong reasons, and worse, the way people who looked like him were treated. It wasn't long before he realized that the battle he'd signed up for was bigger than he thought. As Elijah rose through the ranks, the tension in the department grew. He saw things he couldn't ignore. The truth was hard to face, but he knew that if he didn't do something, who would? Every day felt like a struggle between doing the right thing and fitting in with those around him. His colleagues, many of whom were content to go along with the system, made it clear that Elijah was different. But he wasn't going to back down. He was determined to push for change, even if it meant standing alone. Elijah's conviction didn't come easily. There were moments when he thought about giving up, when the weight of the system and the constant battle to be heard seemed too much. But his belief in justice kept him going. He knew that he had a role to play, not just for himself, but for the people he had sworn to protect. Tom Leem always thought he was above the rules. Growing up, he had learned early on that the world was tough, but with the right connections and the right attitude, he could get whatever he wanted. He'd always been good at playing the system, bending the rules just enough to stay on top. Becoming a police officer seemed like the perfect fit for someone like him, a way to have power, control, and the chance to show everyone who was in charge. From day one, Tom saw things differently than Elijah. While Elijah believed in fairness, Tom cared only about his own success. He didn't mind bending the rules if it meant getting ahead. Over time, his arrogance grew. He started believing that the law didn't apply to him, that as long as he had his badge, he could get away with anything. Tom wasn't interested in the people he was supposed to protect or serve. All he cared about was using his position to get what he wanted. The other officers in the department saw Tom's attitude, but most were too afraid or too indifferent to do anything about it. After all, Tom had a lot of power. He was popular with some higher-ups and knew how to work the system to his advantage. He made enemies. Too many of them were quieter about their disapproval, but they noticed his actions. Tom didn't care. He had always thought that if you were strong enough, you could make the world work for you, no matter who you had to step on. But things started to change when Elijah started pushing for a different way. At first, Tom didn't take him seriously. He thought Elijah was naive, trying to change things that couldn't be changed. But as Elijah stood firm and began speaking out, Tom started feeling threatened. He didn't like the idea of someone challenging his authority. It wasn't long before he started showing his true colors more openly, getting into arguments with those who supported Elijah. In Tom's mind, his world was simple: control everything, or else you lose. And he wasn't about to lose to someone like Elijah. Chief Montgomery had always been known for his steady and calm approach to leadership. He had worked his way up the ranks, not by being flashy or making a lot of noise, but by doing the right thing when it mattered most. His experience told him that change wasn't always easy, but it was necessary. He understood the weight of his badge and knew that true leadership meant making hard decisions. When he first met Elijah, he was impressed by the young officer's determination. Elijah was different. He wasn't afraid to speak his mind, even if it meant standing up to powerful people. Montgomery recognized the potential in him, but also saw the risks Elijah faced. This wasn't an easy environment to bring about change, and Montgomery knew that the system was often slow to adapt. But that didn't stop him from quietly supporting Elijah's efforts, even when it seemed like no one else would. Montgomery had seen a lot in his years on the force, but nothing like the tension that was building between Elijah and Tom. He knew Tom too well. Tom had always walked a fine line between power and corruption, and Montgomery had his suspicions about what was really going on behind closed doors. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. The department had become divided, and it was becoming harder to ignore the deep-seated issues that had been allowed to fester for too long. When the time came, Montgomery wasn't afraid to make the tough call. He couldn't stand by and watch one of his officers treat others with such disrespect. He had seen enough in his years as chief to know that, if he didn't act now, things would only get worse. Montgomery's decision to step in and fire Tom wasn't something he did lightly, but it was necessary. It sent a message: there would be no tolerance for corruption or disrespect. And in that moment, Montgomery knew that the department had taken its first step toward real change. It wouldn't be easy, but with officers like Elijah leading the charge, Montgomery believed it was possible. As Darius walked into the parking lot after a long shift, he could feel the weight of the tension in the air. He had tried to keep his head down, doing his job as best as he could. But it was hard. Tom had been making things worse for a long time. Darius had already noticed the small, cruel ways Tom treated him and others. It was clear that Tom wasn't just upset with Darius for no reason. He didn't like the changes Darius was trying to bring to the department, and he wasn't afraid to show it. Darius had always been the kind of guy who believed in doing things the right way, even when it wasn't easy. But that didn't mean he was immune to the pressures and dangers that came with standing up for what was right. As he approached his car, Tom's voice suddenly broke through the silence. It was sharp, filled with hate. "You don't belong here," Tom spat, stepping into his path. Darius didn't back down. He had faced worse in his life, and he wasn't about to let Tom scare him now. He knew that change was never easy, and he wasn't going to give up just because Tom was making his life difficult. "Maybe that's where we differ," Darius said calmly. "I'm willing to stand up for what's right, even if it means going against people like you." Tom sneered, stepping closer with an ugly grin on his face. "You think you're special?" he mocked. "You don't belong here, Reed. I'll make sure everyone sees that." Just as Darius was about to respond, a new voice cut through the growing tension. Chief Montgomery appeared, walking towards them with a stern look on his face. Darius knew that the chief had been watching from a distance, and he wasn't sure how things were going to go. But he trusted the chief to handle things in the right way. "Enough," Montgomery's voice rang out, firm and commanding. Both Darius and Tom turned to face him, and Tom's smirk faded as he realized the chief was not going to let him get away with this. "Chief, I was just talking to Reed here," Tom stammered, trying to explain himself. But Montgomery wasn't having it. "I think we both know that's not what this is," Montgomery said coldly. He then turned to Tom, his voice firm. "I've seen enough, Lom. Your behavior has no place in my department. I'm done letting you get away with it." Tom's face turned pale as the reality of what was happening hit him. He had spent years climbing the ranks, but now, it seemed like all that effort was about to crumble in front of him. Chief Montgomery didn't flinch. He stood tall, his eyes hard and unyielding. "Turn in your badge and your gun by the end of the day," the chief ordered. His voice was steady and cold, as if he had made this decision a long time ago. Tom's jaw clenched, and he let out a bitter laugh. His eyes were filled with anger, but there was a spark of fear in them too. He stared at Darius with pure hatred, his lips curling into a sneer. "You'll regret this," Tom hissed, his voice low and venomous. But Chief Montgomery didn't respond. He simply gave a sharp nod and repeated, "You're done, Lom. Get out." For a long moment, Tom stood there, frozen, as if he couldn't believe what was happening. Finally, with a growl of frustration, he turned and stormed away, his footsteps echoing through the parking lot. Darius stood there, watching, trying to process everything that had just happened. A weight seemed to lift off his shoulders, but he knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. There was still a lot of work to be done, but for now, at least Tom was gone. At least something had been done about the toxic behavior that had been poisoning their department for so long. Chief Montgomery turned to Darius, his expression softening slightly. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said quietly, "but you did the right thing. You kept your cool, and you stood up for what was right." Darius gave a small nod, feeling a mix of relief and respect. "Thank you, Chief," he replied. "I just want to make sure this department changes for the better." The chief's face was serious as he spoke again. "It's a long road, Reed, but you're on the right path." The training had been intense, and everyone was feeling the pressure. The room was full of officers, and you could almost feel the weight in the air. But when Chief Montgomery stood up, all the chatter stopped. He walked to the front with purpose, his eyes scanning the room. Darius stood tall in the back, nervous yet hopeful. The chief didn't waste any time. He cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice calm but filled with authority. "We've spent days going over the basics, rebuilding trust, and working as a team. But there's something else we need to talk about, something that goes much deeper." Darius felt his heart race. He knew exactly where this was going, and he was both anxious and proud. The chief continued, his gaze sweeping over the room. "Racism is a problem in our department. It's been allowed to grow beneath the surface for far too long. And now, we're going to do something about it." The officers shifted in their seats, some uncomfortable with the topic, others looking at each other nervously. But the chief didn't pause. "I'm going to say this loud and clear," he said, his tone growing stronger. Racism has no place here. Not in this department. Not in how we treat each other or the communities we serve. Darius's chest swelled with pride as the chief turned to him. Officer Reed brought this issue to me. He didn't shy away from the truth. And now we're going to make it right. It's time to face the facts and make real change. A few officers exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement. Others, however, seemed uneasy, but no one interrupted. Chief Montgomery was in charge now, and he made sure everyone knew it. Starting today, we're going to do more than talk about change. We're going to put it into action. We're going to tackle our biases head on with new training and ongoing support. The chief paused, letting the words sink in. If you can't get on board with that, then you're not fit to wear this badge. This is the path forward for us all. Together, the room went silent, but there was a noticeable shift. Some officers began to nod, while others, who had been silent, were starting to speak up. They were beginning to understand the importance of the chief's words. The change was happening right there. In that moment, Darius felt the weight of what was happening. He had pushed for this. He had stood up for what was right. And now it was paying off. Chief Montgomery had made the commitment clear. There was no going back now. The days after the training felt different. There was a shift in the air. Officers began to interact differently, almost as if they were finally seeing each other for who they truly were. The tension that had once hung in the air seemed to lighten just a little bit. But Darius knew this was only the beginning. Real change wouldn't come overnight. It would take time, but this was a start, a big one. As Darius walked through the station one day, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was finally clicking. He passed by officers who had once given him cold stares, and now they greeted him with small nods of respect. They weren't best friends, but there was something different, something better. It was a feeling Darius hadn't expected but had hoped for. He could sense that the conversation Chief Montgomery had started was changing the culture, slowly but surely. More people were talking about the training, discussing what it meant for them, for their jobs, and for the community. It wasn't just about policies anymore, it was about people. Later that afternoon, Captain Hayes found him. She looked pleased but also thoughtful. "You know, Reed, I've been thinking," she said, her voice warm. "This department has a long way to go, but you've already pushed us forward." "What?" the chief said. "It's powerful. It's a start. But it wouldn't have happened if you hadn't spoken up." Darius nodded, grateful but feeling the weight of it all. "I just wanted to make sure we were on the right path. I don't want to keep pretending everything's fine when it's not." Captain Hayes smiled at him. "You did the right thing. And you know, Reed, this doesn't just affect you. It affects all of us. And now, it's up to us to carry this forward, together." Darius smiled back, feeling proud of the difference they were starting to make. He knew this wasn't the end of the road, it was just the beginning of a long, important journey. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful about the future. They had taken the first step toward a better, fairer department, and he was ready to keep moving forward. The training day had finally come to an end, and Darius felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The officers were still talking about what Chief Montgomery had said. He knew that it wouldn't be easy, but it was a start, a real one. For the first time in a long time, Darius felt like they were on the right path, even though the journey was far from over. As he walked to his car, Darius thought about everything that had happened. The chief's speech had shaken things up in a way Darius hadn't expected. People who had once ignored him now seemed to notice. It wasn't just the officers either. He could see the shift in the way the whole department operated. There was a new respect in the air, and for Darius, that was a huge step. When he got in his car, he didn't rush to start the engine. Instead, he sat for a moment, staring out the windshield, thinking about what had just taken place. This wasn't the end of his fight, but it was the beginning of something much bigger. Darius had done what he set out to do. He had spoken up, and because of that, things were starting to change. He knew that it wasn't going to be easy. The fight against bias and racism was a long one, but for the first time, he felt hopeful. He felt like he wasn't alone in this anymore. There was a chance that things could get better, and he was ready to be a part of that change.